Hello and a very warm welcome to the penultimate session of this season's Mishcon Sports Law Academy. I'm Simon Leaf, the head of the sport group at Mishcon, and today we'll be looking at one of the most controversial yet important areas in the world of sports law. It's a topic that everyone seems to have a view on, and it's no exaggeration to say that it's caused sleepless nights for club officials, regulatory bodies, intermediaries, and their professional advisors. The topic, of course, is financial regulation in sport, with a particular focus today on football. Arsene Wenger, the legendary Arsenal manager, perhaps summed it up best in 2015 when speaking about financial regulation in football, when he said, and I won't try to do the accent, "I always did plead for it. Today, I'm not convinced that we can maintain it. Football is maybe only at the start of a huge financial investment. It's become the most powerful sport in the world. Do I want to get rid of financial fair play? I think so, because there are too many legal ways to get around it." And on that note, I'm delighted to say that we're joined today by one of the lawyers that Arsene Wenger was possibly referring to in that quote. He is a man who is well known for helping clients navigate financial regulations, and someone that we at Mishcon have also worked with many times over the years. He's presently ranked as one of the leading barristers in sports law and was listed as one of the top 3 most highly regarded sports law silks in the UK by Who's Who Legal in 2019, and was also featured on the Lawyers Hot 100 list in 2021. He regularly acts for sports governing bodies, players, clubs, sponsors, broadcasters, and agents, and is very much the go-to barrister in disputes in football in particular. He is also often referred to as the Lionel Messi of sports law, which potentially makes Tom and I the Suarez and Neymar of today's session, which is certainly an upgrade on being called poor lookalikes for Robin van Persie and Giovanni van Bronckhorst. He is, of course, Nick DeMarco QC. Hi, Nick, how are you doing?
Very good, thank you. Hello, everyone.
So welcome, Nick. So in terms of how we're going to run the session, we appreciate there's a lot to get through and that people watching at home may have varying degrees of knowledge when it comes to this subject. And with that in mind, the plan for the session is that shortly we're going to see a video providing a real kind of high level overview of financial regulation in football, presented by Tom Murray, one of our leading associates in the group here, and someone that has a lot of experience in helping clients navigate sports regulatory issues. Then we'll bring in Nick, who's going to present on some of his own personal experiences in dealing with issues in this area, before opening up the floor to your questions. So please do keep these coming in the usual way via the Q&A functionality rather than the chat functionality at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so let's get started. Tom, over to you.
Hi guys, my name's Tom Murray. I'm an associate in the sports group Mishcon de Reya and also head of the Mishcon Sports Law Academy. Now, this video is all about financial fair play in football, and we're going to be focusing on 3 key themes today. First of all, we're going to be looking at what financial fair play is. We're then going to be looking at the different regulatory regimes that govern it. And finally, we'll be looking at what happens for club breaches FFP. So let's start off with the first question. What is financial fair play? Now, FFP was originally devised as a concept back in 2009 by Uefa, the governing body of European football, following the 2008 financial crisis. The first regulations governing FFP were introduced by Uefa in June 2010, with the first assessments made in the 2013-14 season. Okay, so what are the objectives of FFP? In Uefa's words, the objectives of FFP were to improve the economic and financial capability of clubs, to encourage clubs to operate on the basis of their own revenues as opposed to others, to introduce more discipline and rationality in club finances, to encourage responsible spending for the long-term benefit of football, and to protect the long-term viability and sustainability of European club football. Now, the central principle of FFP is that clubs should live within their own means, and broadly speaking, Football-related income should at least match football-related expenditure, subject to certain exceptions. Now, this principle is often called the break-even rule, and its goal is to encourage discipline and rationality in spending to protect the long-term interests of football. But what are the different types of FFP rules? Well, people often talk about FFP as being one set of uniform rules, but in fact, there are three distinct sets of regulations that we're going to focus on. Now, perhaps the most well-known example is the Uefa Financial Fair Play regulations. Now, we'll talk more about these later, but as a brief overview, these only apply to clubs that are competing in Uefa competitions, in particular the Champions League and the Europa League. Now, the Premier League also have their own set of financial fair play rules, known as the Profitability and Sustainability Rules. Now, these are fairly short and can be found at Rule E5 onwards in the Premier League handbook. As you might expect, these rules only apply to clubs that compete in the Premier League. Finally, we have the EFL Profitability and Sustainability Rules, which apply to clubs that are competing in the EFL Championship. Now, confusingly, these were originally called the Financial Fair Play Rules and were adopted by the EFL back in April 2012. They were then replaced at the end of the 2015-16 season, and you can find these rules at Appendix 5 of the EFL regulations. So now we have the background to FFP, but why were these rules actually introduced? Well, one of the key reasons for introducing financial regulation in football was to prevent overspending. Now let's focus on this question from the perspective of EFL clubs. From 1992 to 2013, more than 50 EFL clubs suffered insolvency events, including 18 from 2004 to 2012. In 2011, net annual losses of championship clubs was 189 million, with an average net loss of 8 million per club. Financial regulation was therefore introduced to limit what the EFL considered to be reckless spending. Now, a particular concern for the EFL was that clubs would spend beyond their means as a gamble to either get into or stay in the Premier League in order to reap the significant financial rewards in the form of broadcasting revenues, which in the Premier League can be worth between 100 and 160 million a year. Now, this is similar to the stated aim of UEFA's FFP regulations, to prohibit clubs from overspending in pursuit of success in order to avoid financial difficulties. Now, perhaps a more cynical view of FFP is mentioned by Kieran Maguire in his book, The Price of Football, and that is that the more established European clubs were concerned about the arrival of new money into football in the form of Manchester City and PSG, which threatens the footballing hegemony. Now, by introducing controls on their spending, UEFA's established clubs could protect their position and maintain the status quo. However, as we said, this is quite a cynical view. So how does FFP actually work? Well, let's start by looking at the UEFA model. Under the UEFA FFP rules, clubs are required to meet a break-even requirement. Despite its name, this doesn't actually mean that clubs have to break even. Instead, they're permitted to lose up to 5 million euros over a 3-year period as what's called an acceptable deviation. Now, this acceptable deviation can be increased up to 30 million euros over a 3-year period if this excess, i.e. the amount between 5 million and 30 million, is covered by contributions from equity participants. This basically means that the club's owner injects equity, i.e. they put money into the club in exchange for being issued shares. Now, an important point to bear in mind here is that certain costs are excluded when assessing whether clubs have met the break-even requirement. And this includes money spent on youth development, on community development, on women's football, and even things like stadium, infrastructure, and facilities costs. In the Uefa model, clubs are assessed over an aggregated 3-year monitoring period. Now, this includes the current season, which is known as T, the previous season, which is known as T-1, and the season before that one, which is known as T-2. Now, what this means is that you take the total of all 3 seasons together and work out whether there's been a profit or a loss. As an example, if a club makes a profit of 20 million in its current season, being T, but it made a loss of 10 million for the previous 2 seasons, i.e. lost minus 20 over those 2 seasons, then overall the club will have met the break-even requirement. As we touched upon earlier, the Premier League's version of FFP is called the Profitability and Sustainability Rules. Now, like the UEFA model, clubs are assessed over a 3-year reporting period. Now, the key distinction that we need to remember here between the Premier League and the UEFA system is the amount of money that clubs are permitted to lose. Premier League clubs are permitted to lose 50 million over a 3-year period. Now, this is 3 times more than UEFA's acceptable deviation. However, when the owners inject equity as secure funding, clubs are allowed to lose up to 105 million over a 3-year period. Now, this is 75 million more than the acceptable deviation under the UEFA model. Now, like the UEFA model, Premier League clubs' expenditure on certain costs, including women's football or youth and community development, is excluded. Now, these costs shouldn't be underestimated and can be significant, with some clubs spending around 40 million on such activities over a 3-year period. So now let's focus on the EFL Championship profitability and sustainability rules. Now, rather confusingly, the EFL Championship rules on financial fair play are also called the Profitability and Sustainability Rules, or P&S rules for short. Now, the EFL's P&S rules are similar to that of the Premier League and the UEFA, and they have a 3-year monitoring period. They also have similar exclusions, allowing clubs to spend money on things like youth development, women's football, and community development without these forming part of a club's P&S calculation. Again, the key distinction is the amount that clubs are permitted to lose before they face any sanction. Clubs in the EFL Championship are permitted to lose up to 39 million over a 3-year reporting period, provided that any amount over 15 million is covered by secured funding. Now, this amount can be increased up to 35 million a season if during that 3-year period, the club was a member of the Premier League. So as you can see, there's a real disparity here between the Premier League and the EFL Championship in terms of the loss thresholds, which reflects the significant differences in income between the 2 leagues. So does FFP create a level playing field? A common misconception is that FFP is even designed to create a level playing field. FFP, by its very nature, allows clubs that make more money to spend more money. As a very basic example, a club such as Manchester United that makes hundreds of millions in commercial income will always be able to spend more than a team like Crystal Palace. It's important to remember that the goal of FFP isn't to put all clubs on the same footing. It's to encourage them to operate within their means. And where a club has more means, it can obviously spend more. Now, some argue that this entrenches a system of inequality, as those who were able to spend their way to success before the introduction of FFP are now able to enjoy the benefits of this, whereas others are prevented from spending to compete with more established teams. So now we understand what FFP is and how it operates, we can now explore what happens if FFP is breached. So let's start by looking at the Uefa model before turning to the EFL model. The Uefa Financial Fair Play Regulations are overseen by a body that's called the Uefa Club Financial Control Body. Now, this is comprised of 2 key chambers. We have the investigatory chamber, whose job is to monitor and investigate potential non-compliance. And we also have the adjudicatory chamber, who consider evidence submitted, make judgments, and also determine sanctions. Importantly, the adjudicatory chamber has the power to impose an extensive menu of sanctions, including issuing warning letters, fines, bans from European competitions, and even the power to strip clubs of European titles. Many clubs who are charged with breaching the UEFA FFP rules often agree a settlement with the UEFA investigatory chamber, as Manchester City did back in 2014, where they accepted a conditional £49 million fine and also restrictions on their European squad and incoming transfers. Another example of a high-profile sanction imposed on an English club is Wolverhampton Wanderers, who were fined and subject to squad-size sanctions in the summer of 2020. Now, given the limited time that we've got, we won't focus on the sanctions for breaching the Premier League rules, but we'll instead look at the EFL P&S rules, which you'll remember are the rules that apply to clubs in the EFL Championship. Where Championship clubs exceed the upper loss threshold under the P&S rules, a matter is referred to the Disciplinary Commission. The Disciplinary Commission has the power to determine whether a breach has in fact occurred and also is in charge of determining the sanction. In September 2018, the EFL introduced a set of sanctioning guidelines, which are suggestions of the recommended sanction that the EFL board believes that Disciplinary Commission should impose. Now, it should be noticed at this point that the EFL sanctioning guidelines are exactly that, they're guidelines. They do not have any legal force and they're not binding on the Disciplinary Commission, which retains its general power to impose any sanction falling within Regulation 91.2 of the EFL regulations. Now, the starting point for sanctions under the EFL Sanctioning Guidelines is a 12-point deduction. However, this can either be reduced on a sliding scale depending on either the quantum of the breach and whether the loss in respect of T, which you remember is the current season, is less than T-1 and T-2, i.e. the previous season and the season before. The EFL can also request that this sanction is increased by an additional 9 points for certain aggravating factors. Now, there have only been a handful of cases under the existing P&S rules, including those involving Birmingham City, Sheffield Wednesday, and Derby County. As you can probably tell, financial fair play in football is complex and it's a highly contentious topic. Sports lawyers will often work hand in hand with clubs, their auditors, and their accountants to help navigate and interpret the complex labyrinth of rules and regulations that apply. The financial challenges that clubs face have been exacerbated by the pandemic, meaning that those in the football industry will be focusing on financial fair play now more than ever. We hope you've enjoyed today's session. If you do have any questions, please do get in touch. And thank you very much for watching.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for that. So just wanted to follow up on the EFL sanctioning guidelines that you mentioned there. I mean, it's obviously a very topical area given what's kind of going on at the moment and you know how many kind of clubs have kind of fallen foul of those particular rules. I mean, what legal force do these guidelines have, and is the Disciplinary Commission bound to follow them? And if not, as I think you suggested in your talk, you know, what do you see as the kind of point of them kind of going forwards?
Sure. So the sanctioning guidelines obviously apply just to clubs that are competing in the EFL Championship, and if a club exceeds the upper loss threshold, then it's automatically charged with breaching the P&S rules, and the matter is referred to a disciplinary commission. And the Disciplinary Commission is then in charge of determining whether or not the breach has in fact occurred. And if so, it then determines the sanction. So the sanctioning guidelines that we mentioned during the video, I think were introduced in 2018, I think in August, by the board of the EFL. And they were introduced to try and introduce some sort of consistency, so clubs had an understanding of what the likely effect of the breach would have if one occurred. And as we sort of mentioned, they don't have any sort of force in law, and there's been multiple disciplinary commissions who have commented on this, both in QPR and Birmingham City judgments. They've sort of commented, sorry, not in QPR, but in Birmingham City, they commented that they have no actual force, but they are sort of influential, and they are sort of taken into account by the panel when determining the sanction. So yeah, they definitely are influential, but they don't have binding force. It's more of a recommendation of what the EFL board would like to see in terms of punishment. And as we said, there's quite a bit of fluidity in them. So that the sort of starting point is a 12-point sanction deduction, but it obviously depends on two sort of main factors: on how far in excess of the upper loss threshold was the championship club, and if it was 100 million rather than 39 million, then obviously they're going to become more in trouble than if it was close to the mark. And also they look at whether T, i.e. for the current season, the losses for the current season is less than T-1 and T-2. And what that's trying to show is that, whilst the club may have made some mistakes 2 years ago or 1 year ago, it is trying now to fix them, and it's trying to sort of reduce its losses over the course of time. But then also have these 9 points for aggregating factors. So that could include stuff like, whether the club's made a submission which they know is trying to take unfair advantage of the rules, so that there might be creative accountancy at play there, or there might be a failure to cooperate with the EFL, and all of those things are taken into account by the Disciplinary Commission when decided on the sanction.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tom. And I'd now like to bring in Nick. So Nick DeMarco QC, are you there?
I'm here. Yes, can you hear me?
Very good. We can indeed. The floor is yours. Looking forward to kind of hearing more. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to speak to you all virtually. For those of you who might think that this is a rather dry subject compared to other matters that often arise in sport, you are not alone. When I started as a sports lawyer, nearly 20 years ago, I never had any idea that financial regulation in sport would be such an important issue and would take up probably more than half of my working hours as it does now. There are now more cases in football in particular in England. If you look at the biggest cases, those that go on for the longest and have the most people involved in terms of the litigation side of it or arbitration, they are in financial regulation of one type or another, whether we're talking about FFP rules that have just been described to you very well by Tom in his video, or more broadly other elements of financial regulation, because when one looks at the owners and directors test, for example, a lot of that is actually about financial regulation. Or if you look at things like the prohibition of third-party ownership or third-party investment and the rules about from whom football clubs can borrow money and so on, a lot of that is fundamentally about financial regulation. And when you consider all of that, that takes up more of our time in disputes by far now than anything else. And that perhaps does seem, looking back 20 years, when I started and thought that sports law was about challenging decisions about violent conduct on the pitch or doping or the sort of things we normally associate with sports law, I would have been surprised 20 years ago to be told that I would have to become an expert in FRS 102 and accounting standards. I would be very surprised. But perhaps it isn't that surprising, because as Tom has explained, the global financial crisis of 2008, but even before then, I was just, when I was thinking about this talk, I was just trying to remember the first two cases I did in sport in 2002. And both of them actually were about football clubs who'd just come out of, or one was just going into administration, being unable to pay particularly high paid football players at those clubs at the time, because they had entered into agreements that they simply could not sustain. Those clubs could not afford to pay those players. And they were bits of litigation or arbitration about those matters. Of course, that continued, and Tom gave you the statistics, to such an extent that it became necessary, in the opinion of the regulators, to bring in the type of financial regulation that's been described to you today, financial fair play. But what I'd like to do in this talk is ask some fundamental questions about that and really put forward an argument, put forward a debate, perhaps a rather controversial one that reflects my own view. But I have to say, as counsel, my view often is whatever the view of the party that instructs me tells me to have. And so these are personal opinions and not necessarily the opinions of any of my clients. But I'm sure, because we all live in the real world, that my own view has been shaped somewhat by the fact that I've acted for a number of clubs who've been on the wrong end of charges to do with financial regulation. And it's made me look perhaps more critically at some of the problems with financial regulation. And so I want to really speak about those. And then at the end, perhaps talk about what I think is the right approach. And we can have a debate about that. I think it's worth asking the big questions at the very beginning. Why can't you just let football clubs spend whatever they want? Why have any regulation at all? Why treat football clubs differently from any other business? If a club invests heavily to succeed, allow it to. If clubs are simply unsustainable, and they're never going to be sustainable because of their location, their potential fan base, and so on, why not, some people might say, allow those clubs to go to the wall like any other business would be allowed to go to the wall. Why treat football different? Why have the type of owners and directors tests you have? So long as somebody is entitled to be a company director, why have the extra layer of regulation? And I think we should ask those questions. I'm not myself advocating a total free market, free-for-all in football, because I think, like anyone involved in the business, we realize, and the latest controversy about the European Super League perhaps gave us all a very good insight into this, how much football is not simply a normal business, how much it is seen as part of the community, part of local communities, an important part of many local communities. And it's for that reason, fundamentally, that you don't treat football clubs simply the same as you might treat any other business, that regulation is there to protect the viability of football clubs, to stop them becoming insolvent and closing down, and the damage that does to local communities and so on. So I think we should ask the question, but we should also accept that there are good arguments for regulation. And then what one needs to do is see what those regulations are really there for, and are they achieving it? And if not, how can we improve them? And so I want to talk about that, and I'm going to do so in context with some of my own experiences with some of the cases I've been involved in, although I'm obviously not going to talk about anything confidential in those cases, and much of these things some is published, some is not. So you'll forgive me for speaking in some level of generalities for that reason. Tom made the point, and it's a very important one, that financial fair play rules have got nothing to do with competitive balance whatsoever. They are not there to encourage competitive balance. And I, in fact, have a lot of sympathy with the view that Kieran Maguire expressed about at least there being a good argument that they are there or were promoted initially in Uefa in order to protect some of the more well-established clubs from competitors. And that is certainly the overall effect of the type of financial fair play rules you see in Uefa, the Premier League and the Championship, because any rules that are based on the idea that you spend within your means that those clubs which are bigger and wealthier will be able to spend more, and those clubs who are not will not be able to spend more, and so they will not be able to compete. And where that becomes a real problem is the type of thing that happened to the club I support, QPR, back in 2014, but not only QPR, to other clubs who succeeded, had the fairy tale, as it's often described, had rich owners come in, invest, and reach the promised land and got promoted to the Premier League. And so back in 2014, QPR, Leicester and Bournemouth were all charged with breaches of financial fair play rules, the Championship financial fair play rules, following their promotion to the Premier League. And looking back at it, if Leicester, for example, had not breached those rules and as a result, arguably, been promoted to the Premier League, not only would Leicester not have been in the Premier League, but Leicester wouldn't have won the Premier League. And that was one of the most exciting, important developments in English football for a long time. And the stories of Bournemouth and QPR were also very important to those clubs because particularly for Bournemouth, who'd come up through all the leagues up to the Premier League, but they all did so in breach of Championship FFP rules. And that was because they were all clubs in differing amounts that were taken over by more richer investors who were prepared to invest money in to get those clubs to compete at a higher level. In the same way, some years earlier, that happened in Manchester City in the Premier League. And some years earlier than that, that happened with Chelsea. And so the arguably the problem there with financial Premier League, with financial fair play rules, is that those clubs who have already succeeded are pulling up the drawbridge and stopping what they themselves went through, like Man City or Chelsea, for example, stopping other clubs doing that so that they can themselves compete. And so that's one of the problems. The other problem is that whilst the objects of financial fair play rules have got nothing to do with competitive balance, as I have just explained, the objects are to promote financial stability. Tom went through them with Uefa rules. That is also the case with the Premier League rules, the Championship rules. All of the rules you'll see in the regulations that their objects are all to do with financial stability and discipline. And yet, arguably, they also have often acted against those objects too. In particular, when club owners have been prepared to write off debts or invest more money to support clubs, but have either not been allowed to do so by the leagues or have had those debts treated as, had the write-off of debts, had the equity contributions treated as debt, which is what happened in the QPR case. And that means that you're actually discouraging investment into football. And in turn, you may well also be discouraging those who may be able to, who want to buy a championship club and invest money and help it get to the Premier League. You're discouraging them from doing so. And that doesn't appear to me to support financial stability. It may well act to undermine it. And so those are some of the issues that arose, for example, in the QPR, Leicester and Bournemouth cases. The problem back in those days, when we had the old championship financial fair play rules, was that they were not aligned at all with what was going on in the Premier League. So you had a different level of monitoring and a completely different overspends that clubs were allowed and so on. And because the Championship had no jurisdiction over clubs that were promoted to the Premier League, what that meant was that they had a system of sanctions in the Championship that would apply that were relatively sensible and proportionate sanctions. Things like transfer embargoes. So if a club is overspending, you simply stop it from buying players, or you have a what was called a one-in, one-out policy, so that they can only spend it on a reducing level as they're selling players. So they can do some transfer activity, but so long as it is reducing debt. That seems to be a very sensible measure, penalty that can be applied that actually solves the problem. You would, if you'd breached Championship fair play rules and not been promoted, that would be the type of sanction you would have in the Championship. But if you were promoted, that could not be applied to you because you're outside the jurisdiction of the Championship. So instead, what happened was that you were subject to an automatic fine that was essentially on a sliding scale, a pound for pound measure of your overspend. So if you had overspent by 50 million, because it layered up, the fine was 43 or 44 million or whatever it was. And of course, it was not really possible. They talked about doing it, but they never actually did it, to positively impose those fines on clubs that were outside of the jurisdiction of the Championship. So in QPR's case, and the reason that case was first and others settled, they waited until QPR was relegated and then had proceedings and imposed a fine, which was then a record-breaking fine. And I think you know, because it's in public, that we then appealed. There was an appeal. There was a confidential settlement, but again, it's widely reported and evident from the public accounts that are filed that we managed to substantially reduce that fine on appeal. But that was one of the problems. There was the disproportionality of the fine. because the fine had nothing to do with whether you had, for instance, deliberately breached the rules, whether you even knew you were breaching the rules when you were breaching them, because some of the spending commitments QPR had made were made before the rules not only came in, but before the drafts of them were published. So this 3 or 4 year player contracts entered into before the club knowing that those contracts may lead to an overspend. All of those sort of factors, which normally you would expect a tribunal to take into account when imposing a sanction, were excluded. You had an automatic mathematical formula that imposed a sanction. And that disproportionality was a problem, in my view. Of course, the one argument for it is, well, you've been promoted to the Premier League, so you have been rewarded by the massive amounts of income that clubs get when they get promoted to the Premier League, and so you can afford to pay. The problem with that argument is that it followed through, the logic of it followed through. It encourages clubs not to compete. It means that those clubs who are promoted to the Premier League, and there are clubs who have this as a business model, and essentially take the money but don't spend to try and compete to stay in the Premier League, and then go back down again and receive parachute payments, are in a better position than those clubs who compete to stay in the Premier League. And that, in my view, undermines the integrity of the Premier League and of the Championship and the pyramid structure, because clubs ought to be competing to stay in the league and not simply go up and go down again and take the money. And of course, that links to another issue, which is the whole issue of parachute payments. Now, in the QPR case, parachute payments were, if you like, held against QPR, because it was said, well, you're in receipt of these, so you can, this is a benefit you've got as a result of the breach. And one can see that argument. QPR's case was that those payments are made in order to give you a soft landing because of the wages that you have entered into. But on another view, and I know a lot of clubs in the Championship feel this, the receipt by any club of parachute payments makes the whole idea of financial fair play in the Championship very difficult, because some clubs are substantially better off and able to spend substantially more than others. Now, again, the rational argument for that is, well, it's to give them the soft landing. It's to pay for the wages that they've entered into in the Premier League. But what about those clubs that haven't done that, who have just got a commercial model of promotion and then relegation and pocketing the money? Those clubs have an advantage over the other Championship clubs and are not spending the money. Is that fair? These are the types of problems with the one-size-fits-all rules that the rules represent. We now have the new Championship P&S rules, and in many respects, they represent an improvement from the old rules. You don't have what was a completely inflexible automatic fine anymore. You have more alignment with the Premier League rules. You have a 3-year cycle, as you do in the Premier League, which reflects the normal business cycle in football. But you also have a number of the same problems. You have the disparity that still exists with parachute payments that I just described, the discouragement on investors to invest, the low limits, frankly, of spending that Championship clubs are allowed to overspend, which is 39 million overspend over a 3-year period. Championship clubs, perhaps more than any other clubs, are the ones in the forefront of these sort of problems, because a number of them, at least, not all of them, a number of them are all competing every year to be promoted to the Premier League because of the enormous financial success that brings. And that means you do need to substantially invest in order to be able to compete. If we don't just have the same 3 clubs being relegated and promoted every year, other competitive clubs have to substantially invest. And so more and more you have Championship clubs who are looking at failing their P&S, their profit and sustainability amounts. And of course, that's been made worse more recently with the COVID crisis and the financial impact that has had on football. And as a result of that, you have all sorts of creative ways, the quote we heard earlier from Arsene Wenger, all sorts of creative ways of, I don't like to say getting round financial fair play rules, because to the extent that they are not prohibited by the rules, they're not getting round them. There are all sorts of creative ways of reducing your overspend. And the two most common ways of doing that for championship clubs are you either sell players, player trading, or you sell fixed assets. If you're looking at a situation where you're a championship club and you're going to breach the upper loss threshold of 39 million at the end of the season, and you've got to try and get your books to reflect that you're just within it, otherwise you're going to have a points deduction under the P&S rules, then you either sell players or you sell fixed assets. There's really no other way at that stage. And I'm going to say something about selling players in a moment, because that's a more conventional way of doing it. Selling fixed assets is something that was previously not allowed under the financial fair play rules, but under the championship rules as they are now, there's no prohibition on it. So a club can sell its stadium, can sell its training ground, or whatever assets it has. And the big controversy last year in the Sheffield Wednesday and the Derby cases I was involved in was because they had both, in different respects, entered sale and leaseback arrangements where the clubs would sell their stadium to a related company, often the owner's company, who would then lease back the stadium so the club could continue to use the stadium. But the profits of the sale can then be reflected in the balance sheet and show that the club is not in breach of the upper loss threshold. And there is nothing wrong with that. The clubs who are unable to sell their stadium complained about it and made a fuss about it, and that is their prerogative. But there was nothing in the rules that prevented it. The rules did not prevent clubs doing that. And in fact, the clubs, Sheffield Wednesday and Derby, that did it first went to the then chief executive of the Football League and got written approval for everything they were doing before they did it. So there was nothing wrong with those transactions, whether you think it should be allowed or not. It was allowed within the rules. But then the problem is that if you're selling something like a football stadium to a company that is owned by the owner, it's called a related party transaction under the rules. It means it's an intergroup, intercompany transaction. The Football League need to ensure that it's sold at a fair market value, because otherwise the argument is the owner will pay more money for it than it's actually worth in order to reduce the debt on the club's balance sheet. And that was the biggest argument in the Derby case last year, that the decision was published, and the club won on that point, on all the elements of that point, where they were charged with selling the stadium for, it was around 80 million, and the Football League said it was only worth 50 million. And so we had to have expert evidence from surveyors about the value of a football stadium. Now, pausing there, that is a very difficult concept because it is almost impossible, actually, despite the fact we had to do it and we had expert evidence on it, it is almost impossible to objectively assess the value of a football stadium, because it is not like any other asset or any normal asset that you can think of. And what I mean by that is, when you normally assess fair market value, what you look at is what a willing buyer at arm's length would buy something from a willing seller. But no football club is going to want to sell its stadium unless it has another stadium to go to. because it can't survive without playing in a stadium. And no willing buyer is going to want to buy a football stadium to use as a football stadium, as opposed to for property development reasons, if they're not connected in some way with the football club or have some relationship with the football club, because they need the football club to fill the football stadium if it's going to remain as a football stadium. And so you simply do not have a market in the sale and purchase of football stadiums. And so there's a kind of almost theoretical, artificial way, which I won't go into the details of, but anyone interested can read it in the Derby decision, of determining value of a football stadium in these circumstances. Now that just demonstrates to you a number of things. It demonstrates to you perhaps one of the problems with the financial fair play rules is it encourages creative ways to live within them, and then perhaps that reflects the fact that they are too stringent in the first place. And another is, once you engage in those creative ways, it is very difficult to assess things like fair market value. Now, I said I would come back to the issue of player trading, because that is another very important issue in the Derby case. And I'm not going to talk about the facts of the Derby case at all, because although the appeal has been done, there are still consequential hearings going on. But as a matter of generality, one thing that's very interesting about that is that player trading, in other words, the sale and purchase of player registrations, the transfer market, is a very active economic market in football. It's the most active and most important economic market in football. Most football clubs spend more and are more focused on player trading than any other commercial activity. And it is itself a very lucrative and large market, and it's a very sophisticated market with player agents involved and club agents and or clearing houses and all sorts of things. And it is well known and understood in football as the way, or the most important way, first of all, in which clubs may breach financial fair play because they spend too much on players, but secondly, how they may then remedy that breach and come within the upper loss thresholds by selling players, getting them off their books and receiving transfer fees. However, Derby, unlike any other club, applied an amortization approach to its player registrations that reflected what it was doing in the market, or its assessment of what it was doing in the market. And the charge against it, and part of what has been upheld by the appeal panel, is that that is not compliant with financial accounting standards. And there are many arguments about that I won't get into, but a fundamental problem here is that accounting standards, normal accounting standards, are not written to deal with player trading. Player trading is unlike just about any other type of trading you can envisage. And believe me, I've spent months thinking about this and trying to come up with examples. What a club is buying and selling is its registration rights in a player. But in order to buy and sell that registration right, you need a number of parties, you need three parties to come to an agreement. You don't completely own the right and you sell it to somebody else. You need the player themselves to come to an agreement with the new club. And that is perhaps unlike any other type of trading that one can imagine. I can't imagine any other type of trade that involves that. Nevertheless, in my view, and I think it's borne out by anyone who's involved in football knows this, it is quite possible to predict, and clubs have to predict all the time, which players they're able to sell for how much money and which players they're able to buy for how much money. And in fact, they determine their books on the basis of that. But accounting standards don't necessarily reflect that, or aren't drafted to reflect that in the way you might otherwise imagine, because it is a very peculiar and unique business. And that's why simply applying universally without without adapting them to the football industry, general accounting standards, can cause real difficulties. And to be fair, this is difficulty for the Football League as much as it is to the clubs. And that's why the Derby case took so long and is involved so much argument, and you had two eminent panels going different ways on the same point, because it's not in any way an easy answer, an easy question to answer. The other point about the P&S, I'm looking at the time, and forgive me if I've spoken for too long, so I'll try and wrap up quickly. The other point about the P&S rules that is disturbing to me is the sanctioning guidelines that Tom spoke about, because although they are expressed as guidelines and only guidelines, and every commissioner that has imposed them always starts by saying that, they then follow them. And that is usually what happens when you give commissions guidelines. And there's nothing wrong with guidelines, but what they do not properly reflect is the circumstances of the breach. The difference between a good faith innocent breach, for example, and a deliberate manipulation. They don't properly reflect that. They are essentially levied against the amount of overspend. And given that this is a sporting sanction, that seems to me to be problematic. Another real problem with them is that the wording of them, and if you're going to follow them, suggests that they must be imposed in the year after the breach. And in neither the Sheffield Wednesday case, and in Derby, one hopes they never are imposed, but in the Sheffield Wednesday case, they had to be imposed something like 4 years after the breach. And if sanctioning guidelines are there in order to prevent an advantage 4 years later, are you really still benefiting from that particular overspend? And if you're not, to adjust your points in that season is to give an unfair advantage to the other clubs, because it's not reflecting the advantage you've got in that season. So there are lots of problems like that. The final point I wanted to make is that other alternatives, the salary cost management protocol in League One and League Two, in many ways is a more straightforward and more flexible model than the Championship rules. And it allowed for owners to invest with equity contributions in the way that the Championship hasn't allowed so much. The problem with those is that they were not enforced enough, and you had the Bury problem in particular, where an owner did enter into wage commitments that were far beyond the means of the club, and that led to the club going out of existence, and we don't want that to happen. What then came in was salary caps, and I was involved in a case that got those scrapped, mainly for consultation reasons. But the problem with the salary caps was that they were not only that they drive down player wages and, in my view, undermine the pyramid structure of football, because it make it very difficult to have promotion and relegation unless you have a tiered salary cap across all the leagues, and then you'd have to have it in Europe and so on and so forth. The other problem with the salary caps is that because of the way regulations are made in the Football League, which is by a majority of the clubs, you have the clubs who have the least money setting the level for the caps at the lowest possible amount in order to hold back those clubs that can afford to spend more money. And so you get a rush to the bottom, lowest common denominator effect. And so that seems to me to be a problem. So, but very finally, because I know I've spoken at some length, what kind of financial regulation should we have? In my view, there needs to be a loosening up of a lot of these rules, particularly given the COVID situation. The fundamental thing we need is to protect the financial stability of football clubs. And we should not do that by blocking investment. We should not do that by preventing new owners coming in, investing money in clubs, and if that means spending more, having more money in football. We should be encouraging investment, not discouraging it. but it needs to be backed up and fortified. So if you have a new owner coming in, and you're applying the owners and directors test, don't worry about half the things that the Football League get worried about. Worry about whether or not this owner has actually got the funds to support the commitments they're taking on, and then get the owners in some way to fortify, to guarantee that, whether that's by actual guarantees, whether it's by payments, whether it's by equity contributions and not loans to the club. If the owner's prepared to put the money in, let them put the money in, but hold them to it. And that, to me, is the best way to encourage financial stability, but also not to discourage financial investment in football.
Nick, absolutely fascinating. I mean, there's just so many different points that you've touched on there, and we've had lots of questions coming in. Just on one of the last points you mentioned about salary caps. And obviously, we've seen the experience of salary caps in other sports where they've also been quite controversial in how they've been applied. I mean, how likely do you think it is going forward that we will see salary caps kind of come in, particularly in the lower leagues of English football, but also in other sports, as a mechanism to try and control overspending?
Well, I think it's certainly likely we will see them in other sports. We've obviously seen them in rugby, and we're talking about football here, but the biggest case in rugby recently was the salary cap case. And we're seeing them being introduced into Formula One now. They are very popular and widespread in American sports, but there are two things about why we shouldn't get carried away with the American model. There's probably many more than two things, but there are at least two things. First of all, in nearly all the sports in which salary caps are applied quite strictly in US sports, those are closed sports that do not have any promotion or relegation. As soon as you have a pyramid system, it makes salary caps much more difficult, precisely because, if you're in the championship, what's a cap going to be? And then how on earth are you going to attract players that are at Premier League level? Or if you get promoted to the Premier League, how are you going to have a 3-year contract unless you say it drops down to 25% of the wages on relegation? And what good players are going to want to sign that contract? And so it's difficult with the pyramid system. The other point about all those US sports is that they all have very strong collective bargaining agreements where the unions help set the salary cap. And the main reason we won the salary cap case was the EFL in England went ahead and implemented these without the support of the players' union. And I acted for the players' union, and that was the basis of the challenge. I don't see the players' union agreeing to a salary cap in football in any future carnation, but who knows? Interestingly, to me, I think one of the most interesting things about the European Super League experiment, if one could call it an experiment, was that they were talking about a salary cap, but of course they were also talking about a closed league, and it very much was an American model that they were looking at. The one thing that is true, though, is that you're not going to have a salary cap. And I think Wayne Rooney said this at the time. You are not going to have a salary cap in the Premier League unless you have one across the whole of Europe, because why would Premier League clubs allow themselves not to compete with other European clubs? And so unless this was at Uefa level, then you're not going to have one. And I think at the moment it's unlikely to come in, but there are certainly people talking about it and promoting it.
Absolutely. I mean, and on the subject of caps, the other kind of regulation kind of coming down the track is the Intermediaries Regulation. And there's obviously been kind of drafts that have been circulated that suggest that there will be kind of caps that are, or certainly kind of recommended levels as there are today, on what intermediaries can be paid on the back of deals. And I know you, Nick, also like us kind of act for both clubs and also certain intermediaries. How likely do you think it is that a cap at a kind of intermediary level is likely to be successful? And what do you see as the future for intermediaries regulations?
Well, I'm acting for the UK and also international associations of intermediaries challenging FIFA's proposed reforms at the moment. So I again have a rather vested view about this, and there are strong competition law arguments that exist around the FIFA's proposals. I've seen the detail of FIFA's proposals, which I think has still not been published and are controversial. But one thing I will say is this, that they will certainly be challenged. There will certainly be a big fight about them. But even assuming they get in, there are potentially enormous loopholes in the FIFA regulations. And the thing I think I'm most concerned about, stepping back, is the damage to players that this will do, because players are have an unequal bargaining position with clubs, and the extent to which agents are discouraged from acting for players and are perhaps more incentivized to earn from the clubs, which I think may be an effect of these regulations, that will make it more difficult for players in that negotiation. So there is an argument that, and I have to be careful with this because my best clients often are clubs, but there is an argument that the real driving force behind the reform of agents isn't what they say it is. It isn't all the stuff in the press about how bad agents is. It's clubs wanting to drive down player wages, and that's what it's really about. Yeah.
And just kind of going back to a theme that came up in the talk around Derby County and Sheffield Wednesday, and obviously you spoke at length about kind of asset sales, but also about some of the accounting treatment of recognizing the value of a playing squad and how that's treated for P&S and other kind of FFP purposes. What do you see as the future for those kind of calculations and those kind of regulations, given that as you say, the accounting rules are so uncertain? Do you think there is an appetite to kind of amend the regulations to kind of better account for the realities of football, or do you think we're kind of stuck with the kind of present system where we're trying to kind of fit quite frankly a system that's based on accounting rules that don't recognize the reality of modern football?
The problem always with these things, and it's perhaps the one biggest argument for independent regulation. I'm still not sure whether I agree with independent regulation, but perhaps the best argument for independent regulation of football is all these rules at the moment are made by the parties themselves, by the clubs who are competitors with each other. And so, unfortunately, generally speaking, they do not look at this rationally from the perspective of how the rules should best reflect the reality in football and so on. Each club will look at it from their own point of view. How do they stop their competitors? And those clubs that want to overspend, if you put it that way, will take one view. And those clubs that want to prevent other clubs from competing with them will take another view. And all of these decisions are based on those individual self-interests. And that may be the only way to achieve regulation, but it does lead to the sort of problems we have seen. And so I am not confident that what you're suggesting is going to happen, whether it's rational or not. The only thing I would say is that the same people in FIFA who are pushing for the agents caps, which I don't agree with, are also, though, making noises I've seen recently about having a sort of more sophisticated and objective scientific basis for valuing players and international player transactions. And I think that reflects the economic necessity of having to do that. And the fact that there are more and more people now involved in that trade. As I say, it's a more sophisticated trade. So I think whether or not the Championship P&S rules are going to reflect this in the future, increasingly, it will become a more objective and sophisticated market, which should hopefully be more ably measured and then rationally dealt with in regulation.
Yeah, I'm going to bring Tom back into the conversation, and I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have been coming in, and please do keep them coming in. So some really, really good questions. There have been a couple of questions on a similar kind of theme. So one from Craig Honeyman. Will the EFL collapse next season if the P&S rules are applied? Will the EFL get a pass under the cover of COVID? And Callum Harney asks, how has FFP impacted clubs over the past 15 months, i.e. owners dealing with COVID-induced losses? So I think it's a general kind of couple of questions on COVID, and I guess how you see that panning out in terms of, clubs that have recently made submissions, but then also, we've seen in other areas kind of regulatory forbearance where there's been, an understanding that there's been a global pandemic, and obviously, there has been a slight kind of softening of the rules and an awareness that there is a pandemic out there. But do you think we'll see a similar approach when it comes to then actually enforcing the rules?
Yeah, sorry, Nick. Yeah, it's a really interesting question to ask, and obviously coronavirus has had a devastating effect on certain clubs, particularly those lower down in the footballing pyramid where they're more reliant on gate receipts as a source of revenue. Perhaps for Premier League clubs, it's less of a concern because that represents a smaller proportion of their overall income, with broadcasting revenue sort of representing the most significant proportion. So there has been some changes to the rules and regulations that have come into place as a result of COVID. So Uefa were one of the first organisations to make a move here. They actually have a sort of extenuating circumstances exception in their financial fair play regulations, which is something that the Premier League rules and the EFL's rules didn't have. The EFL have also made some changes, and sort of as Nick sort of alluded to, it's quite difficult to change the P&S rules in the EFL because it used to require 3/4 of support of clubs, depending on whether the EFL board supported the changes or not. But that's now been reduced to 2/3. So the sort of two key changes that the EFL made to try and give clubs a bit more of an opportunity to comply. One is changing the monitoring period. So in the introductory video, we talked about this 3-year monitoring period, and that's been extended to 4 years. So rather than looking back 2 seasons, you look back 3 seasons and do T-3, T-2, and then you take the current season and previous season, you take them two together, work out the mean, and then that is the result for T-1 and T. And what that does is, if a club has made a loss, say of 40 million for T-1 and 0 for T, the aggregate or the mean of that is a 20 million pound loss. So there is some changes there which are helpful. The other sort of big change that's come into play is the introduction of these COVID-19 costs, which is allowing clubs to add back certain costs that have been incurred that are directly attributable to COVID-19. And the EFL introduced some guidance in respect of this, which has been sort of really quite interesting for the sports lawyers to go through to try and understand. So in order for costs to be recovered as COVID-19 costs, they have to be directly attributable to COVID-19. They have to be non-speculative. They have to be quantifiable by reference to historical precedent, and they also have to be certified as complete and accurate. And one of this is really challenging, particularly when it comes to, say, the value of a player. If a player's value has decreased, it's incredibly difficult to clubs to say, well, part of the value of the player has decreased because the player is underperforming, or how do we determine whether or not a player's value has decreased as a result of coronavirus? And in the Championship, where we saw, I think, the January transfer window, I think the total aggregate sales is something like 59 million. The market is almost completely died. So there's definitely an argument for that. But the challenge is trying to work out exactly how much of those costs are directly attributable to COVID.
I think you said everything there is to say on that, Tom. I think, great answer to that question. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to kind of try and rattle through a few other questions that have come in as well. So Mark O'Neill asks, is the problem with the FFP rules per se, or the enforcement of the FFP rules? Nick, any thoughts on that one?
Both, I'm afraid. I think I've identified some problem with the rules themselves. I think the two problems you might identify as the enforcement of them are, and I say this carefully, I don't say it lightly, but there is a widespread perception that the EFL at least, I'm not going to speak about the Premier League, but the EFL at least sometimes targets particular clubs for particular reasons in a way that is not fair. It sometimes because of pressure on them from other clubs, and there's a perception by a lot of clubs of some one-sidedness there. And whether or not that's true, I won't comment, but it's a strongly held perception. And I think the best way to deal with that, I spoke before about independent regulation. I think ultimately, although independent regulation is a lovely idea, I probably don't support it entirely, because I think the clubs have to be happy with the regulations they make. They have to make it. But maybe you have independent enforcement. Maybe you take the enforcement away from the EFL and you have a body that is entirely independent, that has a lot of powers. It could even be the FA, which of course is an independent regulator but doesn't have much powers. But has resources. The clubs fund it, but it's independent of them, and that will perhaps be helpful. So yes, that's one problem with enforcement. The other problem with enforcement is, as with a lot of these things, the EFL is, the actual individuals there are all really nice, hardworking, good people under a lot of strain and pressure. There's only a couple of financial controllers, a couple of lawyers in an office up in Preston, and there is so much for them to do and be on top of that they simply can't be on top of it. And they are not on top of it half the time, and that's not surprising. And so in particular, the kind of monitoring that I was talking about of club owners, particularly at League One and League Two level, and making sure that they are putting up the money, that level of enforcement just isn't being done. And that's why I think we saw the Bury situation, the Wigan situation, and unfortunately, I think we'll see more of those types of things. So you need perhaps independent enforcement, and you need to back it up. It needs to have some money. Yeah.
Okay, we've got about a minute or so left. So I've got a final question for Tom, and then a final question for Nick. So Tom, this is a question that's come in from Thomas Horton. Do you think there should be a sanction guideline for other breaches of the rules rather than just breaches of the applicable loss thresholds? And the example they give is what sanction should apply for not properly applying a particular accountancy rule. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And the other sort of potential breach where one could benefit from having guidelines in place is where where clubs are charged with trying to take unfair advantage of the rules or going against not acting in good faith. So yeah, I think the sanctioning guidelines do need to be considered in further detail. And as Nick sort of rightly pointed out, whilst disciplinary committees often say that they are just guidelines, and they do tend to follow them. So I think there's definitely an argument in favour of that. And it could actually lead to sort of more better decision making in the longer term.
Great. Okay, and final question from Matthew Wright, talking about the fallout of the European Super League. What are Nick's thoughts on the new 50+1 club ownership movement? How would fan equity ownership affect FFP? And would you view this as a positive or negative step?
Yeah, I mean, idealistically, I think it would be great. And I think most people in football think it would be great. Practically, I haven't studied the exact proposals of the 50+1 movement, but practically, there is a problem with the fact that football supporters are not going to be able to put in the amount of money, however this is organised, that's necessary to sustain a football club. And I think that what that means is that you may have a football supporters representative on the board. It might be a good idea to have one on every board, but they are going to be a minority voice, and they're going to be consulted, and they're not going to have any real power because they don't have the money to decide whether you buy this player or that player. And I think that's the economic reality of it. So yes, we should encourage more of it, but we have to be practical and realistic too.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and in particular to Nick DeMarco QC for giving up his time. Just before we go, I want to remind you all of the final session in this season's series. We're going to be putting football on trial for failing to promote the women's game and for failing to support women to senior leadership positions. The charges will be brought and defended by an all-women panel of barristers, expert witnesses, and we have a very, very special guest judge lined up. So if you are interested in taking part, particularly if you're interested in being a juror, do please get in touch. But for now, wishing everyone a good day and a good evening, depending on where you are. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.